Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Broughton, your host. Today we have back with us our fearless Editor-in-Chief, the big kahuna, Fritz Eckardt. He is pastor of St. Paul Evangelical Lutheran Church in Kewanee, Illinois, and the Grand Poobah of Gottesdienst. Welcome back, Fritz.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Before we get into the topic, if you guys out there as our listeners have enjoyed these podcasts, please help us to keep it going. Just the various monthly costs and the technology updates that are needed. None of us get paid for this, but we could help. We could use your help to defray the costs of the normal operation of the podcast. Please visit patreon.com/Gottesdienst and become a patron. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep rolling these things out. So Fritz, I wanted to discuss today with you an article that you have coming out in the Christmas edition in your recurring column, Liturgical Observer. We know that from the book of Leviticus, when God, through Moses, institutes the priesthood, one of their primary duties is to distinguish between the holy and the common and the clean and the unclean, and to teach those distinctions to the people. And in your column, you have distinguishing the sacred from the secular, and then that kind of bleeds into a discussion of the two sides, the sacred and the secular of Christmas. What brought this about? Why? What got you thinking about how pastors, particularly in this time, must distinguish between the holy and the common, or the sacred and the secular?
Well, I guess I started thinking about something that I often think about when the preparations for Christmas roll around, and I think about how people decorate their houses with Christmas lights. I think that's where I got started. And I love that. And it's sublime. It's peaceful. I'm not talking about the big blow up Santas and reindeer and things like that. Not that I have a problem with those things, but I'm talking about...
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I really like the light-lined streets that are quiet at night. You know, they make you think little town of Bethlehem type stuff. And I just have always I've thought for a long time that there's something very nice about that, which is almost a kind of a distinction from the wild world, as it were. And that got me into thinking about how we've sort of lost in so many of our churches the distinction between holiness and the regular life, the sacred and the profane.
Now, for you guys out there in Rio Linda, if there was ever any doubt that Fritz Eckardt was a boomer, what he just said totally strips away any other option, right? That you like the Christmas lights.
I like the Christmas lights. And I don't care that they're an Advent. You want to call them Advent lights? That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I've always liked that. And it got me thinking about the history of the Lutheran Church. And speaking of my boomerism, I guess I think back to the days when I was a young pastor, and I was a little perturbed with churches not having the sacrament on Christmas, especially when I learned early on the etymology of Christmas. It comes from Christ Mass, the Christ Mass. The sacrament on Christmas seems to us pretty naturally to be the heart of the Christmas celebration. But Of course, back then it wasn't. It was an occasional extra. And that got me thinking in turn about how the Lutherans back in those days were not thinking in terms of being sacrilegious. And I think maybe I was a little hard on them because I thought it was unconscionable that you didn't have the sacrament on Christmas. Well, in a way it is, but it's not something that people can be blamed for who were simply brought up that way, while at the same time they had a very high regard for sacramental piety, and they took their worship and their Christian life with utmost seriousness, as opposed to nowadays, when people don't do that. They've cast aside the sacredness in all things. So you have churches where pastors' garments are polo shirts, and they try to be, a everyman's kind of man that just kind of blends in with the whole crowd. Well, the problem with that is that you have just failed to distinguish between the sacred and the secular, between the sacred and the profane. And as you pointed out in your opening words, that was a key element in the faith and life of the nation of Israel. Not only did the priests have as their task the importance of distinguishing between sacred or between clean meats and unclean meats and so forth, but also the temple itself was distinguished from the people by degrees. So you go into the temple, you go into the holy place, and then behind the holy place, there's the Holy of Holies behind a curtain that no one ever got to see the other side of except for the high priest once a year. So it might seem a little weird or superfluous to us to have this sense of a holy, very holy place that no one ever got to see or enjoy. But for Israel, this was critical. And I think we've really lost some of that sense, a lot of that sense in our culture and in our approach to celebration and worship today. So in the article, I compared the kind of lack that Lutherans had in America a generation ago with the lack that we have in our generation today.
Well,
namely,
before we get there, you mentioned that our forebears can't really be blamed or, held to account for these things because this is kind of what they grew up with, so to speak, that it's perhaps a better way to say it. It was just a blind spot for them.
Yes, very much so.
And so what were what was it that led to this blind spot? Is there anything in particular that we can put our finger on, or a number of things? Obviously, many times those are mixed bags. But what are kind of a few themes of early American Lutheranism or early American Christianity that our forebears faced?
Well, I think
such that these things were blind spots.
I think that there are a couple, at least, of explanations or theories as to why that is. In the first place, there's the cultural milieu into which the Lutherans stepped when they came to America, and in fact, even before that, when they were surrounded by the influences of rationalism on the one hand and pietism on the other, neither of which had much regard for the sacraments and for objective things that we regard as the heart of our worship. The pietists were more into feelings, and the rationalists were wanting to throw the whole thing out. So there's that, and we kind of tried to extract ourselves from it. I mean the Lutherans who came over the ocean and settled in America. The land in which they settled was a wild frontier in which the situation wasn't much better because they were inundated with tent meetings and with revivalists and with evangelicals of a different stripe of an earlier day. So they had an uphill battle to try and retain some identity of Lutheranism. And at the same time, I think, A second problem that they faced was the lack of sufficient number of pastors on the frontier. So you had circuit riders who went from church to church, especially in the Midwest. In fact, you can find towns in Wisconsin that are built about a horse ride away from the other town, because that, according to the theory, was why they were built, because the churches were there and they had circuit riders that went from one town to another. Well, since they had such a high regard for the ministry, they knew they couldn't, they dared not celebrate the sacrament without a pastor. And so if they didn't have a pastor, they just couldn't have the sacrament. So you waited your turn. You waited till the circuit rider came to your church. And so I sort of suspect that that was a key ingredient as well in what led to the situation in which Lutheran churches had the sacrament maybe once a month. It's just kind of developed that way because that's the only reality they knew. And as you know, once you've done something for a generation, it becomes the way it's always been. So that's what I think. It sort of just developed that way. And then what happened was, and I gave great credit to the generation of the late Robert Preuss in Fort Wayne. Well, first of all, in Springfield, there was a renaissance of understanding of the Lutheran confessions. And he was chiefly, I think, to be given credit for that. And the Lutherans, the professors and their students then sort of discovered, it's almost like the discovery of the law in the days of Hezekiah or Josiah. You know, they found their book. They thought, whoa, look at this. Right. Holy cow, we could have the sacrament every Sunday. That's what it says. So I think there was a bit of a...
Yeah, they figure out that there's an entire feast called tabernacles.
Yeah, right. So holy smokes, look at this. And then they had a severe uphill battle against the entrenched people in the churches who just had no way to relate to this. It wasn't that they were sacrilegious, or it wasn't that they wanted to downplay the importance of the sacrament. On the other hand, on the contrary, they had the greatest respect for the sacrament. It's just that it was, in their experience and in their lives, something they only got to have, say, once a month. That was just the way they did it. It's kind of like baptism. You love baptism too as a Lutheran, but you only get to have it once a lifetime. So this was what they grew up with, having communion once a month or once a quarter. And it was a very big deal. I mean, you had, the people lined up on Saturday to visit the pastor's house and announce for communion, and in some cases even to have a certain form of private confession in preparation for this big deal, which was the sacrament, the communion Sunday. And that's just the way things were. And it was by no means being downplaying the importance of the sacrament. It's just that that's the way they lived. And you compare that with now, where churches, particularly evangelical churches, and we like to follow suit for some odd reason, have the sacrament all the time, but it's practically a sacrilege, the way they don't distinguish between the sacred and the secular. And they treat it, and I'm not talking about the way they think, because who knows what they think. I'm talking about the way they behave. They treat the sacrament as something that can be picked up and shoved in your mouth, kind of like the people in the days of Karlstadt. And the Luther himself was aghast at the way Karlstadt had disregard for the sacrament. He said, come on up and help yourself. Well, even Karlstadt had a higher regard for the glory of the sacrament than many do in our own churches these days. I mean, they have praise bands are kind of the least of the problems now, and that's plenty of a problem. They have clowns. They have, I don't even want to look at it. It's in some cases so bad. They just have ghastly accoutrements for the celebration of the sacrament. And I would have to say, if I'm going to compare, or if I'm given a choice between having a sacramental life like the early Lutherans here And the Lutherans today, I'll take the early Lutherans in a heartbeat. So that's what got me thinking about it.
So one of the kind of common retorts when any pastor nowadays is trying to move from every other Sunday communion is something along the lines of, well, if we do it more often, it won't be as special, or, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Are we, as those who have read the confessions and see that, as it is in all of our churches, we celebrate the Mass every Lord's Day and every festival day, with all of the historic accoutrements, as you might say, have we somehow done a disservice in introducing more frequent communion by then kind of bringing in the common understanding, or an understanding of commonness or not sacredness, to the sacrament itself?
Well, in the first place, I think we should examine that mantra. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. That's almost regarded. It's almost regarded as though it's just got to be true because everybody says it. Well, I know it's not true in my marriage. I want to be with my wife all the time, and I don't think.
But not everyone is married to Carol.
But okay, take a high school sweetheart. Anyone who falls in love with somebody, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Where did that come from? I don't think we have to accept that shibboleth out of the gate. I don't think it's true. And it's certainly not in the confessions. I mean, tell that to Luther, Verily, he wants it done. He doesn't say anything about, well, not too often. In fact, if you look in the book of Acts, I think it's arguable that they had the sacrament every day, breaking of the bread every day. And so, and for that matter, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church throughout the 20th century, which had, as a matter of course and a matter of holy obligation, as they called it, daily masses, they didn't turn from the sacredness of the sacrament because of it. I mean, we have many differences with them on what the sacrament is and what it means, but I don't think they had a sense of it being common because it was celebrated so often. And in fact, you could say the same thing about preaching. Maybe by that token, we should not be preaching every Sunday because absence makes the heart grow fonder. Maybe we should have a famine of preaching and only preach the gospel once a quarter. I know there's some people that would like that, but that doesn't work. I mean, you could make an argumentum ad absurdum, argument out of absurdity. Just take it to the absurd degree, and it doesn't work. So I think that's been kind of a convenient answer for those who just don't like change. And I think I've always said that there's value in the sentiment that people express that they're very conservative with regard to any kind of change. We've never done it this way before. That's actually, I think, for the most part, a healthy Lutheran sentiment.
General attitude.
Yeah, as in general. I mean, because that prevents shenanigans from creeping in. So I think, and that was probably taught to them by their pastors. Because after all, I think it was Luther himself who said, if it's new, it's probably of the devil. So I think that out of the gate, that's a good sentiment to have, but let's not take it too far, because if you happen to find, as Luther himself did, that there was this thing called the abomination of the Mass, and they had always done it that way, but it was wrong. I mean, that's the whole spirit of the Reformation. If that sentiment had applied in the days of Martin Luther, we would never have had a Reformation. So it just doesn't work. So I think you have to kind of, if I were like a young pastor going to my first parish, and there's, they say things like they give you 5 blank checks and that's it. Be careful what you do. Well, I probably would write about 10 of them. But at the same time, you have to respect the good sentiments of people who want to protect their churches. I think that's a good thing. And so you need to be careful in teaching people about this. I think it was a very uphill battle for me in some cases because, I just don't like it. This is new. I don't know what this is. I don't like it. And I would try to say, because they would say to me, you mean to say that the way we've done it all these years is wrong? I heard that a lot. And I would respond, well, no, I'm just saying there's a better way. The way of think of 1 Corinthians. The way of gifts is a good way, but I will show you a better way, Paul says, right before the famous 1 Corinthians 13 chapter on love. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account, lest we become bulls in china shops, which was accused of being anyway. It's kind of nice, in a way, being an older pastor, because I remember when I was young and they would say, well, you're just young. You need to learn how to learn from your people and be careful with them. And you're just full of youth and energy. And you'll see someday that that's not the way. Well, you can't say that to me now. So what you can say is that the people to whom you're sent, in some cases, have very good instincts about not wanting change. But they ought to have, and in my case, thankfully, many of them did have, a high respect for the pastor. And if they do, they will listen to his explanations, to his careful, kind explanations. And that's when changes can happen. So I think, there's some things you just can never do. You need those blank checks because, if they're throwing away the blood of Christ, you can't let that happen. And certain things you just can't do. So you need those blank checks. But even then, you need to be careful because you don't need to unnecessarily step on people's toes. Just that, some of those toes are out of place.
So what happened? Where did it go wrong within, say, the Missouri Synod, within Lutheranism itself, I suppose, where it seems as though we have an increased reception of the Lord's Supper and yet a piety that values it less? Is this that we view it as common and not as sacred? Is this something that we are learning from the culture or from, say, evangelical mega churches? What happened?
I think it started in the 60s. I think maybe Vatican II was a big thing in getting it started because they allowed for, in the Catholic Church, they allowed for certain changes for the worst. And there was a strong cultural influence that invaded the church and wanted to have people, not only in Catholicism, but across the board, wanted people to think that the church was kinder. And you needed to love people to Jesus, whatever that means. And you can't be too harsh with the law. This was a form of antinomianism, really. I mean, you can't just go around saying, it's not good for you to have your brother's wife, Herod. You can't just say things like that. You have to be kind about it. You have to be gentle. And along with this spirit of gentleness came this sense of, if you go to a Lutheran church and you're not Lutheran and you see all this liturgy that's mysterious, you wonder, what in the world is that? I don't like that. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know where they are. I don't know how to get along. I don't know how to sing. So you dumbed it down for them because you're trying to be kind to them. And I remember having this debate over the new hymnal even. You need to meet people halfway, to which I retorted, well, then halfway is all the farther you'll get. I think you need to be gentle in your explanation about things. Of course, pastors need to be gentle with their flock. But you can't dumb down anything because then you've moved the goalpost, so to speak. So you got to have your goal in mind, and you can't waver from that, but you have to work toward it at all times, I think. And I think maybe that's one of the things that was lost sight of in the 60s and 70s when there was just, the term contemporary worship arose out of I think it was the 70s. And worship in that genre today is anything but contemporary. It's basically 70s, which is, I mean, that's 50 years ago. But they still call it contemporary music. And it's not. It's a cultural throwback to the days when this stuff first began to invade not only Lutheran churches, but Catholic churches, Baptist churches, evangelical churches across the board. Churches of all kind became inundated with this creeping secularism in the churches. I remember there was a big debate in the Lutheran churches about Lutheran style and Lutheran substance and evangelical style. It was David Lukey made a big name for himself. He wrote a book, something about that name, and he made great strides in Lutheran churches. We can get along. We can get lots of. Maybe it's partly because there was such an emphasis on evangelism. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but the emphasis was so fervent that we started thinking, let's do anything we can to bring people in. So let's use evangelical style among people that are familiar with it, and then we'll sort of bait and switch. We'll get them in here, and then we'll teach them Lutheran substance. What's wrong with that? Well, as everybody on our side of the fence knows, you can't have it that way because you can't divorce the style from the substance. They're of a piece. The law of praying is the law of believing, as the liturgical people like to say. It doesn't work. So I think that's kind of where it began in the 60s and 70s. I think before that, the challenges facing Lutherans were different. You had a certain strain of receptionism. You had people taking the sacrament almost never. You had a lack of vestments. I even heard an anecdotal thing about the reason the Missouri Synod didn't have vestments was that they were lost on one of the boats coming over from Germany. I don't know if that's true or not. It makes sense. And even CFW Walther was struggling against this cultural trend, even back in his day when they brought in all these Baptist Sunday school songs. And he was incensed about that. So it began to creep all the way back when the Lutherans first came to America. But I think the floodgates were kind of opened in the 60s with Vatican II. And, you know, they all saying when the Pope gets a cold, the Lutherans sneeze. So it's hard to put your finger on it. Not that it matters either. It's what we have to deal with. It's a monster. This blurring of the line between what is sacred and what is secular. That's the monster that is facing us. And I think that's why we have we who kind of know better, have an instinctive revulsion against some of this stuff, even though it's not, so to speak, doctrinal. You can't put your finger on a doctrinal problem.
Yeah. So what is then kind of like the way forward in terms of a pastor? Obviously, it would begin with a pastor recognizing that part of his duty is to distinguish between the sacred and the secular, between the holy and the common. In what manner does he go about that? What are the tools at his disposal for handing on and teaching that distinction?
Well, I think in the first place, my recommendation to any pastor wondering about these things would be that he needs to understand it for himself, intuitively, instinctively. He needs to get a grasp on this distinction, because if that happens, then
get a grip,
then he will instinctively know that he's going to behave differently in church. He's not going to be, to put it crassly, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to anyway. He's not going to be inclined to come strolling out into the chancel right before the service and looking at his people and smiling and saying, "Good morning," and talking to people about their concerns and all these things. Well, let's have our worship hour now. I mean, it's like blending, like turning the corner gently into the sacred without being very jarring about it. Because after all, you wouldn't want to just have stoic Lutheran liturgy without any explanation for your poor visitors. Well, why wouldn't you? I mean, it's sacred. I don't think the priests had any problem with that. It was, and if there is a tradition in the early church that I like to call attention to, which was probably taken a little too far, but I still liked it. It was called the arcane discipline, the secret discipline, which was that there were these secrets that the faithful knew about. When they closed the doors and set the catechumens outside them when it became time for the sacrament, you didn't get to be in there even to hear the Lord's Prayer if you were a catechumen, if you weren't yet confirmed. That may be taking it a little too far, but the idea was, I think in principle, a good one, that actually increased a sense of curiosity about what's going on in there. And I think there's something that we can learn from that. When you treat the sacred as it really is sacred, people will notice. I mean, it's true of children, certainly. If my children, when I was young, would sit next to me and see that I was just kind of fiddling with my bulletin or something, can't say my cell phone because they didn't have cell phones back then, and just kind of being ho-hum about worship, well, then that's what they would learn. But if they wanted to have Cheerios and play with dolls and coloring books and things like that, and I said that was fine, well, that's teaching them something. It's teaching them, well, this is more for other people, and it's not for you, and don't worry about it. It's just nothing to be concerned about. Well, I think there is something to be learned, even if you're a child, from seeing your parent paying strict attention to something else that he regards as very important. Same thing goes for the pastor. When the pastor is busy focusing on the Word of God, the sacrament, the altar, he's not going to be as concerned. He's not going to be thinking about how to be kind and gentle and smiling for his people. I mean, that's not to say he shouldn't be. It's just to say that they're going to notice if your focus of attention is not on them, but on the Word of God as you proclaim it. I think there's an unspoken difference between a pastor whose focus of attention is on the people and the pastor whose focus of attention is on the word he proclaims. And I think the latter is what is required of us, even by our confessional vows, by our ordination vows as pastors, which is really the only good thing for the people after all. I mean, but I think that's kind of critical, that we get caught up in this idea that you got to focus on what the people's felt needs are and how we can show them that we really, really care about them by smiling a lot. They used to tell me that you got to smile a lot. I don't know. Maybe I don't smile a lot. Well, I'm busy, and I don't tell jokes in the pulpit either. I mean, that's where that whole business came from too, I think. Tell a nice little story to start off the day. This is time for you to settle back into your easy chair. Pretend your pew is an easy chair. Just sit back and enjoy the ride. It's kind of a stand-up comedian there in the pulpit. He's going to entertain you for 15 minutes or so. That's kind of what you exude when you sort of let down the sense of liturgical presence during the sermon, as opposed to being like the prophets and like the apostles and like Jesus. I mean, you can't imagine a sermon by Peter starting off with a joke. That's just unheard of. Why? Because he had a task, he had a sacred obligation that he had every intention of fulfilling. And when the pastor operates with that sense of urgency, without even saying anything about it, that's going to become evident to the people to whom he preaches. So
what you're kind of talking about here is the task of the pastor to orient not only himself, but also his people by his example toward the holy things and not the common things.
And this goes right back to Israel as well. The high priest, you don't see any of this in the liturgical customs. The high priest, let's say on the Day of Atonement, was supposed to go into the Holy of Holies. He wasn't supposed to tell people, now here's what I'm going to do. Don't be afraid. I'll be back. I'm going in there and you don't need to know. You don't need to see what's going on in there, but I can't show it to you because it's against the rules. But yeah, I know there's strange rules. I don't understand them either, but that's what we have. And there's none of that. So where did we get this weird notion that we got to, I remember when when I was a pastor up in Wisconsin, we had a school, and there was one teacher that just took it upon herself to take her, I think it was fourth grade students, into the church and give them each a taste of a host and the wine so that it wouldn't be mysterious to them. And I found this out. I about blew a gasket. I said, why would you want to do that? Who gave you permission to do that? You want it to be not mysterious to them? What do you think? We call it a sacrament. It's a mystery. And I think, that sentiment, that sense of wanting things to have their mystery removed is a great problem in our midst. The mystery is there for a reason. It's the divine mystery, as is the incarnation itself.
So I take it from kind of what you've said is that what the tools at our disposal, and we could probably say this not only of the pastor, but of the father at home, the tools at our disposal are what we say and what we do. Right? So not only the things that we actually end up talking about, but also then what we do with our bodies. That all of these things convey or demonstrate what it is that we think and believe is going on, right? So we have ceremonies that go along with what we say so that we can also teach what is happening. We don't have to draw attention to what is happening when we demonstrate what is happening by what we do with our bodies.
I think, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that mantra I kind of like, because what you see ought to be congruent with what you're saying, or else you're sending the message that you're just kind of mouthing the words and you don't really mean it. If we believe these things, if we believe that the incarnate one is among us, is in front of us, would we want to stand? As I think our colleague John Stevenson once put it, you would stand before the incarnate one? There's no law governing that. There's no, these liturgical rubrics are not laws. They arise in every case out of a sense of what it is. We really do believe that the sacrament is what Christ said it was. Well, if that's true, then who am I to play fast and loose with it, so to speak? It's really simple, I think. And that's what leads so many pastors into so much trouble. And believe me, I know what that's like. So in spite of all your best efforts as a pastor, when you're called to a new congregation and you want to do things a little bit differently, and you wonder about which blank checks you have and so forth, and how you're going to handle things, sometimes you're just at a loss. I know I was a few times in my ministry, and you suffer for it, and there's just no way around it. But that's what happens in the battlefield of the church militant.
Yeah. Now, I've always tended to kind of distinguish in terms of changes that can be made along these lines, that if it's something that only I do, I kind of just make the change. But if it's something that the people must do, right, if it's something new for them, then I tend to take a little more time to instruct or catechize them into what this new thing is. So when there are ceremonies that doesn't in any way affect what the people actually do in the pew, I just typically do them. And then when people ask me, I take the time, and they invariably do, just take the time to explain what that's all about and why I would do that. Why would I, genuflect during the consecration, or why would I elevate?
Or why would I sing the words of institution
and the Lord? Yeah, or any of those things.
Sure.
I've just typically done them. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, even that can get you in a heap of trouble.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't avoid trouble.
Right.
You're in this world.
And so I remember, and I was in some cases, in spite of all I've just said, rather harsh about some things in the way I did things. Not harsh in terms of what I said, but for example, when you were talking, remember the time when people were complaining that I genuflected, and they were really making a big stink out of this, to which I responded without saying anything, but finding opportunities to genuflect more, because I think I got their attention. And that's good. Look, pay attention. I'm bending the knee here because of what's on the altar. And it's just, I feel for pastors who, on the one hand, want to be kind and get along with their people. Everybody wants to get along. And sometimes you just can't have that. And then on the other hand, there's pastors who are so eager to do things right that they step in unnecessary piles. And it's just a terrible road to have to hoe, so to speak. I sort of mix my metaphors, but not quite. It's a country road along a farm where there's piles. You can't get around it.
Well, I mean, you do kind of have to just, in general, get over the fact that you just can't go about your ministry thinking you have to walk on eggshells, because you will never, ever do anything.
And I've said this.
You have to just kind of boldly be a shepherd.
I've said this before, I know, that a pastor needs to be comfortable with his own authority. Because if you're not comfortable with your authority, you're gonna abuse it. It's gonna come out all wrong. Same thing goes with a father who knows his place, or with a business manager, or with a government official. I mean, imagine if a police officer didn't understand his duty and just thought that, well, he needed to try to, well, that does happen in places like Seattle these days. I mean, see the results of that kind of nonsense. You need to know what you're tasked to do and who gave you the task, and that's job one. And if you're comfortable with that, and it's also a matter of faith, that the ministry is not a job, it's a holy calling from God, from Jesus. And you have that sense of awareness as you approach the office and the task. And then when you get trouble and grief for it, you say, well, it's part of my job to try and explain things to people, but it's not my job to make them happy. I mean, I remember I got a lot of grief for saying once, I don't care what you think about me. That was just foreign to some people. Why wouldn't you care what I think about you? Isn't this a popularity contest of some kind? Because if you're not popular, how are you going to get anywhere with the people? Well, there might be a grain of truth in that, but this is not. It's not a political office where you have to please the people enough to win the election the next time. Your boss is not your constituency. It's your Lord, and it starts there. And that's when you get, I think, the sense, without even having to spell it out for yourself, of the distinction between the sacred and the secular. The sacred, this is God's realm. I am ill-equipped to try to cross it haphazardly, and not only ill-equipped, but I dare not, because that's out of bounds for everybody, even for me.
So distinguishing the sacred from the secular, we're often placed into this position. It kind of brings us back to where we started during Advent and Christmas and other seasons of the church year versus the seasons of the secular year. How does a pastor navigate, or in what way should a pastor recognize the goodness of those kind of secular traditions, or even say like patriotic traditions, without it infecting, as it were, the secular traditions?
Yeah, I think I referred to some of this in my article that's coming out, that there's nothing wrong with those secular traditions. I kind of like them, actually, some of them. And even the patriotic stuff, as long as you don't regard it as sacred. Santa Claus, for example, he's just a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And why deprive your children of that fun and that sense of fantasy? There has to be.
Well, don't tell Peterson.
Yeah, he doesn't like Santa. Well, newsflash: Santa is fantasy, and I don't have any. I don't have any problem with what's the Rowling characters, Harry Potter, or Lord of the Rings. Those are all fantasy. That's fine. They're cool books. They're mythology. I don't have any problem with that at all. But you have to make the distinction on the other side too, that you don't let the sacred bleed into that realm either. So that's why, for example, I like a lot of secular Christmas songs, but I really don't like what's the Santa Claus? There's a Santa Claus. Is it Santa Claus is Coming to Town? Where
Bruce
not that
Springsteen?
one. No, the regular one. Where so Santa Claus is coming tonight. That one. So hang your stockings and say your prayers. I hate that. You don't bring prayer into the Santa realm. It doesn't belong there.
Yeah.
And you just learn to be instinctively wanting to cringe about that as much as the other. Because, when I was a kid, everybody made that distinction. There was no problem at all with telling kids that Santa was real until a certain age. But I always knew that had nothing to do with Jesus. It's just because of the culture. You never saw reindeer in church. It was unthinkable. So this whole idea that once you learn that Santa's not real, you'll think, well, what about Jesus? Maybe he's not real either. Never occurred to me. And I don't think it occurred to anybody. I think that's a false narrative. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have a problem with that. So I'll get in trouble for this too with guys on our side of the fence, but I really don't have a problem with Christmas parties during Advent. I mean, I know you're supposed to be fasting and so forth. I call it the lesser fast. So you can break the fast for a Christmas party. That's fine. Go to the office Christmas party, have a church Christmas party. That's fine. You're just singing those Christmas carols to get ready for Christmas. That's fine. I'm fine with that. But let's not bring that into Advent services. I love Advent hymns for Advent. But if you want to have a Christmas party at your house, that's all right with me. Again,
Well, there you have it, folks. It's okay to have a Christmas party.
Yeah,
according
again,
to Fritz
that's
Eckardt.
making the line clear on the other side.
Right. Well, thanks for your time, Fritz. Any final thoughts?
Well, hang your stockings and don't say your prayers. Because Santa Claus is coming. Santa Claus is, I won't say it. Santa Claus is coming to town.
All right. Thanks for your time, Fritz.
Have a Merry Christmas this year, everybody. And a blessed Advent, too.
All right. Take care.
All right. You too. Bye.